Let's start.
Okay, so
In fact, we want to talk about the U.S. strategy in the sea, the sea power, something
Yeah.
like that. So
Okay.
that's why we want to talk. And also, in fact, I have read your book. It's just so excellent.
thank you.
So for you, you are very excellent in the study for the U.S. Navy. I think because you work in a museum. You
Yes. Oh, as a matter of fact, before I forget, I don't actually work in a museum. I'm a trustee.
Oh, okay.
So I'm involved with the museum. I
Yeah.
go there 7, 8, 10 times a year. And I talk a lot with the executive director and the various other trustees and members of the staff. Trustees have individual areas of responsibility.
Yeah.
Some people are responsible for the human resources, the staff and how much they get paid. Other people are responsible for public programs.
Yeah.
Other people for the buildings and grounds and what priorities we should have fixing the buildings. And my expertise is working with the collections and publications.
Yeah.
So I work most intimately with what we consider the core mission of the museum, which is what it collects, why it collects it, what it gets rid of, because we've been around for 54 years, I think.
Yeah.
And in that time, particularly early on, we collected a lot of stuff that doesn't necessarily fit with the mission. So sometimes while we're acquiring new things, we're also trying to get rid of stuff that doesn't quite fit and takes up a lot of space and might be better off at a different museum.
Yeah, but I want to know why you want to read this book. This book is for the sea and the civilization. I think it's the first time someone read a book for just the sea and the civilization. How can you make the link between these two things?
Well, I think that maritime culture and maritime activity has been central to the development of the world.
Yeah.
From the very earliest times, when people first went to sea, perhaps we don't know when, but at least 50,000 years ago, people had been putting out on the water to get from one place to the other, or to fish, or to hunt, or to explore.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the pace at which things happen on the sea, it's much faster than when things happen on land. So you can look at a territory on land, and there's a group of people here and a group of people here, and they can sort of sit there and be neighbors and fight, and not much happens. There's some exchange.
Yeah.
But then you look at something like the Yuan dynasty comes into being, and all of a sudden they're in Java, or they're trying to invade Japan, or they're trying to invade Vietnam. These are 2,000 miles away. If you tried to go 2,000 miles overland, it's a much slower, more difficult process. So you see the transmission of ideas, you see the transmission of goods, the culture, religion, philosophy, disease happens much faster at sea and much more dramatically. But I think one of the problems with the way maritime history has been written is that it focuses on the dramatic moments without necessarily taking stock of all of the developments that preceded those individual events. And so what I wanted to do is say, when it came to sort of a staple of Western history, the voyages of Columbus, I don't want to see them as a surprise, because there's actually hundreds, if not thousands, of years of development of technology, navigational expertise, culture, business, that goes into those voyages. It's not like space exploration, where people are sort of thinking, well, we can now go to space, let's just go there. It wasn't, Columbus wasn't an explorer for the sake of exploring. He was actually a business person. He was a merchant. He was trying to get into a known market.
So for you, a business is important. You give us a definition like a navy, commercial complex.
Yes.
Yeah, I read your book. But in this long history, can you give us some example, some country that can be seen as a maritime state?
Well, I mean, there are maritime states, and there are states that have at times put a lot of effort and energy and money into developing maritime trade, maritime sea power, naval power. But at those times and in those places, they have a very significant and discernible maritime orientation. But at other times, those same countries have withdrawn from the sea, have not been as concerned with naval power, have not been as concerned with sea power or maritime trade. And so I think that it's not always a good idea to speak about maritime powers because a maritime power can change. Just as a child can grow into being an athlete, he or she wasn't necessarily an athlete when young, and after a certain time, they're no longer athletes. They're tired. They've got other concerns. So there are states which have at times embraced sea power or maritime trade or naval power or fishing, and there are other times when that has not been the case.
So for you, now just the modern U.S. is a maritime state or not? I don't know. 桑树的
Grapefruit.
Yeah.
Grapefruit. Okay.
I don't know.
谢谢。
It's cool.
It's like 柚子.
Yeah, 柚子
What?
Orange.
Oh, that's my
orange.
tea. Oh,
It's orange juice? Okay.
Something like orange.
sure.
It doesn't matter to me. I'm going to house, but I just got confused.
Look, it's nice to give you a little boat.
This
It's
is.
a boat on top of a pyramid.
I thought this was a French art museum.
Right?
The Pompidou.
Pyramid.
Where's that? Yeah.
Yeah, the Pompidou.
Pompidou?
Oh, no, not the Pompidou.
Pyramid.
The Louvre.
Louvre.
Yeah, I am pay.
I just remember from the stupid movie. Yeah, the Louvre. That's right. It's in
Louvre.
front.
Yeah.
So, yes, we can speak of countries that have had have been maritime powers at one time.
Yeah.
So, for instance, Britain was a great maritime power in the 19th century,
that's right.
and for periods before that, and somewhat in the 20th century.
Yeah.
But today, it has a small navy, its merchant marine is not that big, and the people of Britain are not that interested in or concerned about maritime power.
But I want to know it's why the British Navy strategy failed, and why is American now he is the superpower in the world. It's not the British, but just a long time ago, British is so great. He is a great empire, and I want to know why there is a change.
Great Britain went broke. World War I, the Depression, and World War II basically made it impossible for them to maintain a navy. It made it impossible for them to maintain an empire. That, combined with the resistance to empire, particularly in India, and then everything else followed from that. So what that shows you, I think, is that in order to be a maritime power for any length of time, you need a combination of lots of money and lots of interest in building maritime power and maintaining it. Once Britain was no longer a sort of an important colonial power, it lacked the interest in developing a navy, because in order to maintain an overseas navy empire, they needed a combination of maritime trade, and they dominated that with their fleet, and they needed to protect their fleet with a navy. But when they suddenly didn't have any of those interests overseas, or they were diminished, they didn't have to maintain a navy, and their reliance on a maritime merchant fleet wasn't as great.
So that for you, the commercial is more important than the navy force.
Yes. Yes.
For example, I think Japan is an example. In the era of Meiji, he developed a very fast navy force. But because his commercial is not very developed,
Right.
so in the Pacific War, he failed. I think that it can explain your.
Well, in the Pacific, I mean, I don't really know that much maritime. I don't know that much of the Japanese history of the rise of the militarist state and the greater Japan prosperity sphere. But you do see the rise of the Japanese merchant marine and the rise of the Japanese navy, as well as the rise of Japanese industry, all happening at the end of, after the opening of Japan, particularly in the late 19th century. And they imitated very, very carefully what was going on in Europe, particularly the British, to a lesser extent the French and Germans, and a little bit the Americans. And they were able, I think, to develop their navy partly because they were also developing their commerce, and the two went hand in hand. And you frankly see the same thing happening in China today. Trade is booming. The Chinese merchant marine is very large, and the Navy is following suit, which is very predictable and expected, and there are lots of historical parallels in the United States, Britain, France, elsewhere, certainly Spain, the Netherlands. So, but once the Japanese Navy was defeated in World War II, well, first of all, they weren't allowed to have a navy, and second of all, their commercial fleet was devastated. But under the auspices of the Americans, they were able to rebuild their industry and to rebuild their merchant fleet and to rebuild their shipbuilding industry. And they did a very good job of that. But they were allowed to do that, and encouraged and supported by the Americans, who saw the Japanese as a good hedge against communism, either from Russia or North Korea or China or even Vietnam. So it was a good ally, and the Japanese knew a good deal when they saw it, and they said, well, okay, we'll take your help. Now we're moving into another era of sort of who knows what's going to happen next with Abe and the concern about revising the Constitution and all that. But the Navy and the Merchant Marine go hand in hand. It's very hard to have a Navy without a Merchant Marine. And it's not entirely necessary to have a Navy if you have a Merchant Marine. So, for instance, Greece does not have a very big Navy. It has a very large Merchant Marine.
And I have another question. In geography, British and U.S. is different.
Yes.
U.S. is bigger, and they have a vast.
They have two coastlines. Three if you include Alaska.
So maybe I think their maritime strategy will be different.
Oh, it's completely different because they have.
Can you give us some detail to tell the difference between the U.S. and the British?
Well, and this sort of goes to your question about Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mahan has this whole theory about how these are the particular ingredients you need to go into being a sea power, and he lists them all, and some of them are clearly based on what he saw Britain had that as a sea power, but I don't think that he really, I don't think he said, these are the ingredients that they had to have, and oh, by coincidence they have them. I think he looked at the sea power and then made up his list after the fact. So then he goes on to say that the United States is like Britain, and so it too will be a sea power. But if you look at some of the characteristics, geography being the most important one, if you look at Britain and you look at the United States, it's like
different.
they don't look at all alike.
Yes,
So-
it is.
And it's crazy. And I've actually wrote a short talk that I gave last year that I'd be happy to send you a copy of, in which I sort of go, here are the things he lists, and here are the ways in which, you know, the United States and Britain are completely unalike.
Yeah.
So all that really is to say is that it's very hard to make theories about what makes sea power, what doesn't make sea power, whether a country is a maritime power, whether a country is not a maritime power. The Greek philosophers abhorred maritime trade. They said that cities should be built 10 miles from the sea so that you wouldn't be polluted by foreigners and their foreign languages and their food and their religion and all the rest of it. Yet the Greeks were clearly a very maritime-oriented people. The Athenians, especially at the height of the Athenian Empire in the 5th century. And of course, when you bring this question back to China, the question, people always say, well, is China a maritime power or is it a continental power? And what does that mean? And clearly, China had very little interest in the sea for many periods in its history as a government. Well, as a government, the Chinese emperors had very little interest in the sea for much of the history. But if you look at...
But why the Chinese government have little interest in the sea?
Well, I think there were two primary reasons. One was their primary concern was the western borders, the northern borders, and the Mongols and the Khitan and all of these, and the Tibetans, who had invaded and had a record of invading the long western border. So their preoccupation was with defending themselves against Central Asia. At the same time, in earlier periods in history, the coastal regions were, first of all, they weren't that well integrated into the empire, so they weren't that concerned with what happened there. And the second place is that there were no powers that were capable of really threatening the coast of China by sea. So that was the sort of geopolitical reason. But the cultural reason was Confucianism and the antipathy to merchants generally, and the concerns about dying away from home and not being able to take care of your relatives and all that kind of thing. So those were the two sort of traditional elements and explanations for the concern. And you see this in the abrupt shift from the UN's expansionist policies of they didn't have to worry about the Mongols because they were Mongols. So they invaded Japan, they invaded Java, they invaded Vietnam. And then the Ming come back as a native dynasty, and their immediate concern is we have to worry about the Mongols because now they're our enemy. We've just gotten rid of them. Yeah. So at the same time that is the official government position, you had fishermen, you had coastal traders, you had smugglers when it was explicitly outlawed, you had people going overseas and creating what Wang Gungwu is a Chinese Singaporean historian called Merchants Without Empire. So you had huge Chinese colonies, not technical colonies in the European sense, but huge concentrations of Chinese people living in Batavia and in Ayutthaya and in Manila and in Nagasaki, where there were also European colonies, but the Chinese actually far outnumbered the Europeans. But they didn't have the respect of the government, and they didn't have the government did not have their backs. And so when there were massacres in Manila and Batavia of the Chinese populations, the government's basic position was, well, you shouldn't have been there anyway, we're not going to worry about you. So I think we always have to make a distinction between official government policy and what people who are actually interested in maritime affairs are doing, because they're generally completely different, or can be.
I think this difference exists also in U.S. You know, in early history, we just like Washington in this area. I don't know how the sea strategy in this area. Can you give us some explanation?
Well, George Washington was very concerned about the development of a navy. He thought that a navy was important to respect, to the respect of the, to earning and maintaining the respect of foreign powers.
Yeah.
Because he said if you can't defend yourself at sea, then people will not take you seriously and you will not be considered a player on the world stage. And interestingly, in this article I mentioned to you that's being published in a while, I quote George Washington alongside of a Chinese official who made exactly the same argument in about 2004.
Yeah.
And you read these two passages side by side, and it's like, well, if George Washington was right for the United States, really this guy is right for China. It's not a very popular opinion in the United States in the naval circles, but you can't argue one way for one person and have the same argument and say no, it doesn't count because they're Chinese, and So it's when I send you the article, you can read these quotes and you will see it is absolutely uncanny. It's like the Chinese guy was like basically rewriting Washington.
Yeah.
So these are the sorts of concerns that, I think when we get away from simplifying our understanding of what sea power is, what the rationales for having navies are, how we should promote maritime trade, all of these things it's a very fluid history, and we have to be very careful about sort of compartmentalizing people or countries or ideologies, because the reality doesn't fit very well with any of that.
In fact, I noticed there is a change in Roosevelt. Roosevelt, the president
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt. There's a change. So I want to know how normal people accept his idea, because just in the area of Washington, they like sea, but not very much. But in the Roosevelt, he said we want to be a great power, so we need to develop our naval force. So how the normal people accept his idea?
Well, I think that it's. Again, just to go back to Washington, one of the big political schisms in the Federalist period was between merchant class and the farmer class.
Yes.
So Washington sort of straddled those two ideas. Thomas Jefferson was very much against navies. Hamilton? Yeah, Hamilton was very big on trade and central banking and all that kind of thing. Jefferson was notoriously against developing a navy. He made a lot of really dumb mistakes in terms of trade policy. He drove the country into a recession by imposing a unilateral embargo and saying U.S. merchants cannot sail overseas. Just like that. Not unlike the Ming Dynasty, basically. He would have made a great Ming emperor. When you get to Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century, the United States had been devastated by the Civil War. The sectarian divisions between the South and the North, well, in some respects they still haven't healed, but they were still very raw for the next 30 or 40 years. Then you had the rise of sort of the great industrialists driven by oil, the railroads, iron and steel, people making huge fortunes and becoming very involved in trade. And there was a big move away from protectionist policies and a big move towards opening up American trade with particularly Europe, but the rest of the world as well. And hand in hand with that went the idea of, sort of asserting American power overseas. And Theodore Roosevelt had been a naval secretary or assistant secretary of the Navy during the Spanish-American War. And when he became president, this was also at a time of great a great change in the development of warships. And so the Americans kind of lagged behind Europe during a period when warship design was undergoing all sorts of transformations. And then in the 1890s, the Americans suddenly decided that they wanted to be back on the world stage. And they developed a very robust navy. And he thought, okay, well, in order to sort of announce our navy to the world, I'm going to send the fleet around the world. But he painted the ships white as a symbol of peace. And the idea, and it was called the Great White Fleet. And the idea was, this spoke very clearly to his policy of speak softly and carry a big stick. And speaking softly was painting your ships white and going as peaceful ambassadors. Big stick was sending out a navy and showing people that you had one and that you were willing to use it. So I think that was all part of an America kind of coming out of its shell and embracing the doctrines of Alfred Thayer Mahan and embracing the idea that we wanted to be, if not an absolute colonial power in the European mold, at least a colonial power in terms of business interests and being willing to promote our trade and to protect our trade overseas.
So now, after First World War and the Second World War, United became the superpower in the world. And now we know the global system is American.
Mm-hmm.
No, is with American. But we know we have another system. Just like you have here, you read in your book. Here is the Parker's Pony Tanica.
It's the Pax Britannica.
And we have
Pax
also
Romana.
the Peace of Rome.
Yes.
Donc, if there is some difference of the modern global system and the Pax Britannica and the Peace of Rome.
Yeah. So Pax is peace. So Pax Romana was the Roman peace, and that was the peace around the Mediterranean. And as I write in the book, the Pax Romana really would be better described as a Mediterranean peace, because it was on the Mediterranean that its fleet basically kept everything in check. And there was very, very little fighting on the Mediterranean for hundreds of years because the Romans just basically dominated everything. They quelled piracy, they brought all of the potential naval powers and they tamped them down. So there was peace in the Mediterranean. There wasn't peace anywhere else in the Roman Empire. The German borders, the British borders, Central Asia, it was all a mess. But it was the Navy because everybody living around the Mediterranean basically benefited from feeding Rome or being fed by Rome. And there were Roman officials everywhere, and it was very easy to control the populations. On the borders of the land, the Germans, the Celts, the Picts in Scotland, the people in the Iranians, the Parthians, all of those people were constantly gunning for the Romans because the Romans, frankly, were overextended, but they didn't know when to stop. Similarly, in the 18th century, Britain became the dominant maritime power. Spain had basically fallen on hard times. There was no interest after the loss of the American colonies. There wasn't any interest in taking over new American colonies, so they didn't Spain decayed on its own. It lost all of its colonial colonial possessions in the Americas, but it didn't lose them to European states. It just lost them, and they became independent, as the United States had been. In Africa, that was a completely different issue, and that era of colonialism is completely different from the 18th century colonialism. But Britain, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, had defeated every major navy in the world and had reduced every other country to basically accepting British hegemony on the high seas. Then with the Industrial Revolution and industrial developments, particularly in shipbuilding, the British just vaulted ahead of everybody else. And they had the Navy to protect their merchant marine, and their merchant marine was the most sophisticated in the world. It had the best ships, the best engines, and the most number of ships. So they did create a Pax Britannica that was not very peaceful. If you look at British history, they were fighting a pretty significant war every year of the 19th century.
Spanish.
Yeah. So they were fighting, in Afghanistan, they were fighting in India, they were fighting in South America, they were fighting everywhere. Little battles, but, enough to keep everybody else from thinking, these guys are crazy, they will fight anybody, anywhere.
So in your eyes, America is more similar, like Roma, but not British.
No, it's actually, I think, more like the British, because America has been fighting wars every year for as long as I can remember.
But I think now it's peaceful than the 18th century or 19th century.
No, the United States has been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq for 16, 17 years. Before that, we were in Vietnam for, close to 20 years, 15 to 20 years, depending on how you count it. We've invaded countries in Latin America.
But why there is a lot of war and a lot of invaded? But I know why they want to use the war to maintain their conversion.
I don't know. There's a very, very powerful military industry in the country that profits a great deal from buying weapons, selling weapons and developing weaponry. So that's a huge problem. I think there tends to be a simplistic view of how to solve problems. There tends to be a simplistic view about how willing the rest of the world is to adopt American values, which I admire a great deal, but I'm not stupid enough or vain enough to think that just because my ideas are good and I like them, that anybody else should like them. I think if my ideas are really good, people will follow suit just because they're good ideas. Just as I'm not going to force anybody to read my book or to accept my point of view, but if you read the book and the argument's compelling enough, that should be enough.
But I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No.
I think I agree with you that the perception of America at war is smaller today than World War II or Vietnam War, because mostly they're smaller individual places.
Also, we have nuclear nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
And so it's not the same as a war footing for the whole country for World War II or 250 soldiers in Vietnam.
But we have military units in something like 140 countries.
Sure. We've been in Germany for a long time, and in Korea for a long time, Japan for a long time.
War is
but it's not an active war.
way to maintain the balance in the worldwide.
Well,
Maybe.
Well, that's your view. The book ends at fishing and the book ends with fishing and nuclear ships and what was the third part? Environment.
Yeah, and containerization.
Tassia, though, to 1950s to today, it's we're very worried about the environment and fishing, overfishing and stuff like that.
Yeah, overfishing.
That's what I was thinking anyway.
Yeah.
I'm writing down words like abhor, antipathy, and embargo because I'm learning these in Chinese.
Okay.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. So I think that there are, I think that the American peace since World War II looks to me a lot more like the Pax Britannica than the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana, as I said, the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean was a genuine peace. On the borders, where it rubbed up against foreigners, it was not peaceful. And I think that that's a... and the other thing is that like the British, it's the fact that the Americans have a big navy and can project power great distances that enables them not only to defend its allies, which is wonderful, but also to, attack its enemies. The Navy played a huge role in Afghanistan, although Afghanistan is landlocked.
Yeah.
So that you can't get into that kind of trouble unless you have a navy. Ireland doesn't attack Afghanistan, but we can because we can just park ships in the Arabian Sea and fire missiles in, and fire planes in, and helicopter people in. So, there are significant drawbacks to having a large navy. If it's, a navy is good, but you have to use it prudently. It's not good enough to be. It's like having a gun and just going into places and shooting people. You can do that in America, but normally you're not supposed to do that.
In your eyes, Mahan's theory is would we use navy force or not?
I don't think Mahan's a very useful guide for the United States, for China, for Britain, for anybody. He was writing about a very particular period and a very particular set of circumstances. He was writing about the age of sail, for God's sakes. I mean, you couldn't fire a cannonball more than about 3 miles. And, we haven't had line of battle ships for, 20 years. That was the last time there was one. The age of missiles, the age of nuclear weapons, the age of nuclear power where you can drive a submarine around the world without surfacing. He's changed completely what Mahan was talking about. And Mahan was one of the first people to say, circumstances change and you should change your policies accordingly. And people seem not to, their copies of the book doesn't have that sentence in it. So they just sort of keep reading Mahan and going, well, this could be sort of like what we're doing now. And no, it has nothing to do with it.
It's German and Japan who just read the book and copy Mahan's theory.
Well, they did, and that did give you some, in World War I you had some great naval battles, but they were indecisive. The biggest one, Jutland, people still argue about who, if anybody, won the Battle of Jutland. And in World War II, there was only one major battle fleet battle, and that was in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and the Japanese lost, and that was it. That was the end of the age of the battleship. And the irony, of course, is that when the Japanese surrender came, it was on the deck of a battleship. But the battleship hadn't actually fought very much, if at all, in World War II. But it was named Missouri, which was the home state of the president, Truman. The ships that won World War II were aircraft carriers, and it would have been much more appropriate and dignified and easier to get more people on if they'd had the signing ceremony on the deck of an aircraft carrier. But within the Navy, there was also a schism between the people who sailed surface ships and people who sailed aircraft carriers. And the people who sailed surface ships were still the guys who were sort of in charge. And that was considered the appropriate place. It was a battleship, not an aircraft carrier. So, the symbolism even is sort of lags the reality of what was going on.
Yeah, I just wait a moment because I need to check.